The Black Scholar, Journal of Black Studies and Research, Volume 2, 1971, Issue 7. Pan-Africanism 2, Pan-Africanism and the Black Struggle in the U.S. by Charles V. Hamilton. Charles V. Hamilton is a professor of political science at Columbia University, New York City. He is co-author with Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, of Black Power, The Politics of Liberation in America, 1967, which played a crucial role in popularizing the concept of Black Power during the Civil Rights Movement. His is the author of The Black Experience in American Politics, 1973. He popularized the term institutional racism. His academic work often focused on the political structures and processes affecting African Americans, and he contributed significantly to the understanding of racial dynamics and political activism in the United States. Through his teaching and writings, Hamilton influenced both the academic field of political science and broader social movements advocating for civil rights and racial justice. Pan-Africanism and the Black Struggle in the U.S. For purposes of this essay, Pan-Africanism will mean, first, an awareness that the interests of African peoples, wherever found in the world, are essentially similar, and second, that organization, policies, and programs must ultimately point toward and support that awareness. This will mean, obviously, that the specificities of Pan-Africanism will be different in immediate manifestation with each indigenous area, but the overriding ideology will be constant. African peoples are at varying stages of political and economic development on the African continent and in the diaspora. They are faced with glaringly different immediate circumstances, but the underlying imperatives of African unity and development are common to all. Precisely because immediate circumstances vary so markedly, it is difficult at times to perceive the commonality of long-term interests. It is understandably difficult, perhaps, to perceive a connection between unity and development on the African continent, on the one hand, and the pressing imperatives of Black political and economic development in other parts of the world, on the other hand. But the connections are there nevertheless, and a correct Pan-African ideology will illuminate the relationship in both its short-term and long-term dimensions. Long-term goals that envision a viable, united African continent will permit one committed to such goals to evaluate and analyze short-term processes in his own indigenous setting. Thus, whether a particular short-term strategy of working for Black community control of schools or of law enforcement agencies in the United States is considered reformist or not, will be measured by the relationship of these programs to the ideology of Pan-Africanism, not to some other ultimate goals or ideological formulations of legitimacy. In other words, what constitutes socio-political economic legitimacy depends on one's criteria for what constitutes legitimacy in terms of achieving Pan-African reality. The Black struggle in the United States at this historical stage necessarily must engage and deal with such real, important issues of survival as jobs, housing, education, community control of important decision-making institutions. These are pressing, persistent problems that must be dealt with here and now. Organization, policies, and programs must be geared toward achieving these intermediate goals. And across the country, there are Black groups dealing with these problems. They are faced with all the inevitable problems associated with intense, dynamic political struggle, shortage of resources, seemingly divergent ideas on tactics, obvious injection of divisive elements to deter action, etc. But to assume that such would not be the case would be naive. These efforts to deal with day-to-day problems have been labeled reformist, with the connotation of being irrelevant to the overall struggle. They have been categorized as even counter-revolutionary in the sense of not leading to drastic change. Whether these conclusions are correct or not depends precisely on one's understanding of the relation of these short-term goals to long-term goals. They depend, indeed, on one's analysis of the nature of the 20th century. They may well be reformist, but when seen in an overall ideological framework of Pan-African struggle, I suggest they constitute the necessary steps to be taken at this precise historical period, that is, in this time and in this place. It is possible to identify four basic resources of organization for power, four resources around which a group can attempt to mobilize for power: land, economic resources, ideology, and arms, i.e., military weapons. The possession and maximization of any or all of these can lead to the possession and accumulation of power, that is, ability to make and influence decisions. Black Americans are notoriously weak in economic resources and arms. They have greater possibilities for initial development with land and ideology. Their relationship to land is one not massively of ownership, but of occupation. They occupy strategic land positions in the cities of the North and in some cities and counties in the South, and their numbers, always of crucial importance in political calculations, are growing. This can be a political advantage if used wisely. In an electoral system that is predicated on geographical subdivisions, it becomes politically important that Black Americans are geographically concentrated. Their numbers may not permit them to control many political bodies, but they can influence elections at certain levels and in certain places through the wise use of voting strength. Thus, a policy of residential dispersal of Black people is precisely dysfunctional to the exercise of electoral power. This is not to advocate the containment of the Black community within stipulated boundaries, but to be cognizant of the nature of its expansion. It also points out the need to analyze carefully the precise kinds of political benefits to be obtained from different kinds of political office. A political analysis that totally discounts the efficacy of electoral politics at all stages of the political process is an unintelligent analysis. Utilizing the relationship to land, electoral politics can be a very useful tool for politicizing people, even if it is not significant for deriving mass benefits. In fact, this may be its ultimate long-term function. Land, also, is a source of taxes. Wherever Blacks occupy and control the land, politically, they can fight to reap the benefits of the taxes from that land. All these become not absolute panaceas for growth and development, but they can be used as levers for maximizing political influence. Ideology is precisely relevant because it speaks to consciousness, self-interest, and long-term goals. A people who understand who they are and how they are to progress in a particular society are not likely to submit to someone else's definition of their goals and methods, and they will be able to define their interests in the larger societal context, which definition will recognize that identifiable groups, racial, ethnic, functional, geographic, first seek to consolidate their own forces. In a heterogeneous society, as contrasted with a plural society, to proceed otherwise is to court political disaster and to entertain a luxury very few groups can afford in 20th century United States. None of this will be relevant to one who does not see the feasibility of major socio-economic political changes on other than economic class terms. Rather than attempt to reconcile these views, which is really probably not possible, it is best to clearly state the areas of disagreement on premises. Whatever is the case in some other countries, and at other historical periods, the United States is not on the brink of being toppled by a violent, class-oriented revolution. The masses of exploited workers and the vast unneeded and unemployed are not being radicalized through a process of ever-increasing pauperization. The whites are attempting to consolidate what slight gains they think they have made since the New Deal, and the Blacks are attempting to struggle for a greater share of the power and goods and services. The problem between the two is precisely that the federal government will have to play a substantial role, and recognizing this, the Blacks are calling for new relationships between themselves and decision-making institutions, which promise to threaten the vested interests some white groups have with those established institutions. Thus, Blacks want a significant restructuring of institutions of decision-making power in order to maximize benefits from decisions, and whites, uncertain about the consequences of this in terms of their future positions, resist these changes. The white working mass does not see itself as the oppressed victims of a capitalist oligarchy, but rather as the potential losers in a modernizing process being waged on the part of Blacks, and one they, the whites, understand largely in terms of lost jobs, reduced status, and reversal of power positions, i.e., privilege based on racial identification. Indeed, if institutional racism means anything, it means that an undifferentiated group, whites, have generally benefited from the subjugation of blacks. Therefore, most whites are not candidates for an effective alliance with oppressed blacks, as long as they do not perceive their ultimate interests as reasonably similar to those of black people. And when Pan-Africanism is put high on the black agenda, such an alliance becomes even less likely. It is not sufficient to say that the poor whites are being duped or brainwashed by the capitalist class, because those poor whites are holding on to their meager gains precisely because they have dreams that their children can do better in the future. The Puritan ethic of work and achievement, the present economic recession notwithstanding, is still, unfortunately, very strong in the American ethos. Man may indeed be a product of the modes of production, but when those modes are perceived as basically functional to survival and development, this view becomes merely a description of what is, not a prescription of impending revolution. James Boggs, Winthrop Jordan, and others have presented sufficient evidence of the formation of white attitudes and the benefits whites derived from suppression of blacks to permit us to move to another level of analysis. Others, perhaps most notably W.E.B. Du Bois, recognize the weakness of the school of thought that ignorance or lack of knowledge of racial conditions perpetuated black oppression. At some point, we must recognize the persistence of ethnic identification in American politics. We have had enough empirical studies on this subject to keep us from reinventing the wheel or starting de novo on this issue. Black people, certainly more overtly oppressed, more outwardly alienated, are being increasingly politicized by their condition. It would be dangerous and misleading, however, to assume that the expressive violence in the cities in the late 1960s was a prelude to violent, successful, instrumental revolution. These are manifest indications of serious social problems, but a highly complex industrial society is more likely to opt for forceful and successful repression of violent demands than for concession. As this is done, it is more likely that masses of black people will become politically traumatized rather than politically radicalized, thus becoming inactive, dependent citizens in the midst of the body politic. The nature of the international modern political struggle in the latter third of the 20th century has several implications for the black struggle in the United States. There are today two major areas of violent revolutionary struggle in the world: Africa and Asia. At this time, these areas are experiencing violent nationalist revolutions. The role of the Western nations, especially the United States, is crucial to these revolutions, and that role has traditionally been one of intervention to impede the revolutionary tide. Focusing on Africa, relatively little attention is given in the United States to the tremendous impact this country has on maintaining the racist, exploitative, oppressive rule of white South Africa and Portugal, and to the impact of neo-colonial forces over the millions of blacks. And this relative lack of public attention is precisely related to the relative lack of power blacks have in this country. The United States is involved with Portugal through NATO in helping suppress the freedom fighters in Mozambique and Angola. There are more than 60 private U.S. companies investing and doing a thriving business in South Africa, bolstering the white-dominated economy to the detriment of millions of the black majority. President Julius K. Nyerere made the following observation in 1969. It is possible that South Africa would refuse to make any concessions to the democratic sensibilities of its allies, even at the cost of complete international isolation. I say this is possible because many people in South Africa believe in apartheid as a religion and will defend their faith until death. But there are other South Africans who rejoice in, and who support, the segregationist policies of that government because of the material benefit and the position of privilege it gives them. I believe this is the majority. Such people give support which is conditional to the extent that it is not based on fear. There is a limit to the degree of international isolation they would be willing to accept, rather than accept an organized move towards individual human equality. At the very least, therefore, strong Western pressure on South Africa could introduce a new uncertainty and new insecurity among the dominant group. The police-state machine would thus lose the virtually total white support which it at present enjoys. In that case, the violence may not be of such long duration or of such bitterness, but whatever the situation in South Africa, it is quite certain that Portugal could not withstand real pressures for change exerted by its NATO allies. A nation can withstand pressures from outside when it is united in hostility to that pressure. But a poor nation cannot maintain its domination over territories 20 times its own size, and over populations 50% greater than its own, unless it has the support of more powerful countries. In relation to the Portuguese colonies at least, members of the Western Alliance do have the power to secure peace in Africa. They have the power to make a continuation of their support conditional upon Portugal's accepting the principle of self-determination. Thus, in one case certainly, and in the other case possibly, it is the West which makes the choice between peace and war in Southern Africa. The question is not whether the Western powers are able to exert pressure on Portugal and on South Africa, but whether they are willing to do so. It is the implications of that question which I hope the people of this and other countries will carefully consider. Black Americans living in the midst of the strongest Western nation have a vital function in the modern political struggle. That function is to utilize the resources of land, economics, and ideology to maximize black political power in this country, in order to influence, reverse, neutralize Western intervention in revolutionary developing Africa. This can only be done from within the United States, and it can only be done by an economically and politically powerful force within this country. It is difficult to imagine any force other than blacks taking the initial interest and the lead in this struggle. The admonition of President Nyerere will only be heeded if black Americans organized and powerful take the lead in reversing policies of this country. This will be Pan-Africanism moved beyond articulation and pronouncement to act and progress. This is a protracted struggle, not an ephemeral one. It means that black forces must see their role as organizing at a level of operation calculated first to develop the collective political and economic strength of the group. Where land is a factor, this will dictate pursuance of policies of consolidation and expansion over land areas, not pursuance of policies of dispersal of the black population. It will require the development of policies and formulas for dealing with the politics of land areas to ensure legitimate delivery of services, to ensure that the resources allocated for education and medical care and law enforcement, for example, are, in fact, utilized for the purposes stated and by the people intended. The implications for new directions black institutions will take are enormous, politically, economically, and educationally. The initial goal should not be to develop unrealistic economic ventures to try to rival giant corporations within this country, but to pursue those economic plans which do two things: develop as much economic independence for as many as possible, and lay a foundation on which succeeding groups can build as they accumulate economic, political, and educational tools for power. Ideology is crucial in this struggle because it will provide an orientation, a direction. It will give black people goals beyond mere acquisition of power for limited use in an indigenous capitalistic marathon. It will point up the relationship between the revolutionary struggles in Africa and the politico-economic struggles in this country. It will point out that revolutionary success in South Africa will be the first time in modern history where oppressive forces in the minority will be overthrown by progressive forces in the majority, in a society not plagued by economic or technological underdevelopment. Indeed, all of Africa has natural resources yet to be developed. These resources will be developed by and for the external, neo-colonial forces, or by and for the millions of black Africans. What the latter course will mean in the long run for the shape of future international economic and political power can be readily seen. The struggle of black Americans, therefore, is central to this overall modern political struggle. It does not require that one put aside demands for constitutional rights or for community control of schools in the black communities to take up the struggle for African independence. It does not require that one neglect efforts to elect a black mayor in the cities heavily populated by blacks, or to put aside efforts to elect more black congressmen or black sheriffs, or give up the struggle for jobs on federally supported construction projects. It requires that these positions be filled by enlightened black people who understand their role in the larger context of the Pan-African struggle. The fact is that until black Americans maximize their political and economic power in this country, they are of little value to any struggles waged anywhere else in the world. These are thoughts aimed at defining the role and relationship of black Americans to the ongoing struggle for survival and development of Africans throughout the world, to Pan-Africanism. All groups in the modern, heterogeneous world relate to a homeland, and this is taken as a given. Neither is this understood to be contradictory to cooperation among peoples and nations in an international body of co-equals. Black Americans must realize that their struggle, their immediate struggle, has serious implications for the independence and development of a unified Africa. It is not expected that others should define, or even necessarily understand and agree with, these implications. But Pan-Africanism is clearly the next viable stage of the historical struggle of black people to assert themselves on the world scene. It is primarily necessary that both black Americans and black Africans recognize their common self-interest, that neither will develop unassociated with the other. There are surely those blacks in this country and in Africa who believe otherwise. It is also understandable that part of that belief may be based on their particularistic relationship to white sources, a relationship they feel they cannot or should not jeopardize. Whatever their particular circumstances, they are clearly inconsistent with the social forces of the 20th century. White Americans have always traced their roots, and they have turned that process into political advantage. Black Americans have the same responsibility. Professor Elliot P. Skinner, former U.S. ambassador to Upper Volta, has stated the situation in the following terms. Today's world differs from the time when Wilson refused to recognize the appeals of blacks in Africa and in the diaspora for help and surcease from oppression. At that period in history, Europe's star was still ascending, most of Asia was still colonized, and the peoples of Africa were still largely unacquainted with the nature of Western civilization. Today, all that has changed. True, the United States still has overwhelming power, but it lacks the benefit of the awe in which whites were once held, which made their domination possible and easy. Today, the United States or any white power has to remain armed to the teeth in order to impose its rule on black or colored peoples. Colonialism failed as soon as it was challenged by educated colonials, and, not surprisingly, whites both in America and South Africa find that they are having to resort to force to meet the growing challenge of the blacks. Blacks in America are prepared to use all techniques and institutions to help America chart a realistic policy for Southern Africa. The reason for this is self-evident. Unless America supports a policy in Southern Africa by which all the people living there can have equality, then it will never develop a policy by which all of its own people can lead a full life. Pan-Africanism recognizes that in this period of history, with international alignment of economic, political, and military forces being what they are, it behooves all African peoples to effect a rapprochement for our collective survival and development. Anything less is to misread the fundamental nature of the modern political struggle both in Africa and in the diaspora.